Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. Simply pour a can in your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
On today's episode, we're going to tackle a subject I know just a little bit about, and by little, I mean not very much at all, but I definitely have enjoyed it, duck hunting. I've only been in the duck goose blind a combined 4 times, which pretty much makes me as far from an expert as you can get, but today's guest is my good friend, Alex Yerges from Pacific Calls. He spent a bunch of time with the birds and has even more knowledge, I would say, regarding the ducks and duck calls. So welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, thanks, Jake. Glad to be here.
How have things been, besides busy?
You know, yeah, just busy. I mean, as you know, because we talk every now and then, in the middle of building the shop and trying to get some construction done in the cold weather and doing all that. So we've had some very interesting days as of late.
Yeah, and for all of you that don't know, Alex is co-owner of Pacific Calls. They do a lot of work with us, for us. Over the last, I'd say, 5 or 6 years, we've worked together. We've grown together. It's been awesome. But I know when to wave the white flag and bring in some duck hunting experts, some duck call experts. So I'm glad to have them here. Yeah, in talking with the local duck hunters here, it seems to be a pretty slow, rough start, even though as a Western big game hunter, it seems like we've got the cold weather. It seems like we've got the snow, but evidently it hasn't been the right weather, at least down the I-5 corridor, to bring any ducks in. They said they've been, shooting limits here and there, but it just hasn't been as good as it has the past 20 years yet.
Yeah, no, and I mean, we've run into a little bit of that, and we're in kind of a different, into the fly where the Cascades really do divide us, pretty much, and so we spent a little time up in Alberta chasing them around, and there was tons of food, there was a fair amount of water for them to hang around in. So I think your guys are probably right. They just haven't seen the crazy amount of weather to really freeze them out and start pushing them down, even though it feels like they should be here. I'm guessing they're, maybe one more real good cold snap or at least a long length of time cold snap before we'll be into them pretty thick.
Yeah, they expect here in the next, within the next 2 weeks, we've got some cold hitting right now. We're supposed to be in the, the high teens, low 20s for the next couple weeks. So hopefully we'll get a new push of birds in here. So
and from a calendar standpoint, that's usually about right for us too. In between Thanksgiving and Christmas is when we typically see our, most of the migration, pass through here.
Gotcha. So it might be on par, just maybe a little bit slower. So like we start all of these podcasts, we're going to start with 2 questions from users. And the funny thing is I'm not a prolific waterfowl hunter, duck hunter, so I had to go dig for some of these questions on some of our past posts. But if you have a question of your own for Cutting the Distance and my guests, please email us at ctd@phelpsgamecalls.com, or just go ahead and send over your questions to me via message, and we'll get them on here. So the first question I was able to pull, do you need decoys to duck hunt? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, for myself, yes, but technically, in most instances, as long as you've got an area that the ducks are, coming to, you're not necessarily trying to attract them, maybe a small body of water or something like that. No, you do not technically have to have them. You can also shoot them legally if you would like. That's not necessarily the preferred way to do it. So, I mean, the most legal answer to the question is no, you absolutely do not have to have them. But for myself, my preferred method of hunting is indeed over decoys.
Yeah, and so like I said, very inexperienced. Went on a duck hunt last year. We hunted from boat. One time we had more duck decoys than we needed. The entire boat was full. We rode on duck decoys out there, and so one day we set 8 dozen decoys. The other day we hiked into a spot. You carry a half a dozen decoys and maybe a jerk rig with you. In Washington, electric rigs are illegal, so we're creating movement with jerk rigs. Or do you feel it matters? Do they become more comfortable when they see a spread of 5 dozen ducks, 10 dozen ducks, or just a small group? Have you noticed much difference? I'm thinking from a perspective of a new duck hunter. Maybe you only want to buy 6, 12, see if you even like it. Like, are you going to notice a huge difference on birds committing?
I think it honestly depends a lot about where you're hunting and the situation that you're in as well. Again, like my spread almost always 100% is adjusted depending upon where I'm hunting. If I have more of an open water kind of scenario, I typically go with a bigger spread. I've got more room. If I'm in a small spread, about 18 is the most that I would take. And again, it is kind of predicated on how many trips you want to make, whether you're carrying them, whether you do have a boat, a cart, anything along those lines. So I don't think there really is necessarily a magic number, but I can tell you the idea of I'll get more ducks if I just have more decoys is definitely a fallacy.
Yeah, and like I say, I'm coming from a very elementary point of view here, and so I'm just observing what I'm seeing. It seemed like the number one thing, and we'll probably get into that here in a little bit, is like just being on the location was more important than how many ducks. We had seen that this corner was loaded up with ducks the day before. We go sit on it, and of course the ducks just want to be there anyway, so it made our lives easier. And I'm going to expand a little bit on this question, which kind of surprised me is like the jerk rigs and the movement on some of these decoys. As we're sitting there, ducks are approaching from above, they've got great eyesight, and all of a sudden, I need to be moving my arm and pulling this thing 3 feet each way. Is that typical? Like, will these ducks, as long as they're focused on movement on the water, let you get away with some of the extra movement? Like, to me, as a big game hunter, like the last thing I want to do is something approaches is like start waving my arm around. Regardless how well I think I'm covered out front, like they're above me. Like I assume they could see me.
Correct. I mean, we always have that, that mantra, whatever. You want to try to minimize movement in the blind, but maximize movement on the water. And so, we're very much so in tune as far as trying to make sure that we've got a correct hide. You want to have stuff covering over the top of you. And, in some ways, ducks are... the easier is not the correct word as far as that goes, but your movements and the attraction level that you're at, you're kind of way more separated from them, and so you can get away with a little bit more than you can in like a big game scenario. But we certainly do our best to try to make sure that we are covered up 100%, faces are down, nothing bright and glaring, and you try to minimize as little movement as you possibly can.
Yeah, and we're going to try to focus this on duck, but I know I got to hunt with the co-owner, Pacific Calls, your partner there, Trevor, geese hunting, and like it, we've got to be so still inside this blind, like no face showing, but yet when the geese are coming into the field, somebody's allowed to jump out with this big white flag and like wave it around. I'm like, all right, I'm confused. I don't know what you're allowed to do. I don't know what's good and what's bad, but it just, is me trying to wrap my head around. I had to laugh about like what you can get away with, yet what you can't get away with, is these waterfowl are approaching. So,
big time. Yeah, you're going to run into that.
Yeah. This one will tie right into, the event that was last weekend, the World Duck Calling Championships, and then kind of what we do on the duck calling side. How good of a duck caller do you need to be effective? Is there a threshold? You need to be at least this good to kill any ducks? If you're better, you'll call it more. Like, in your opinion, a lot of these guys get everybody you get to listen to on social media, typically is a good duck caller, maybe way better than average. And so I think a lot of these people that are, sometimes timid or don't even want to blow on a duck call when they get out there, but how good do you have to be effective in it for it to work?
I mean, realistically, not incredibly. The entire idea of the call is to get their attention and to add a little bit level of realism into the hunt. And so if you are in a situation where, it's a quiet body of water or something along those lines, one of the more effective calls that you can have in your arsenal, believe it or not, is actually a little whistle, just doing a drake whistle or a teal whistle or a widgeon or something along those lines. And that takes very, very little skill level to operate. And I'm glad you mentioned something like Worlds, because if anybody paid attention to Worlds, that is not a competition in which you're, attempting to actually, call ducks like you'd hunt them. That is an operator contest to prove that you can, run a call from the absolute highest echelon that it can be ran at all the way down to the lowest. So there's, a little bit of a caveat with that. But as far as in the field goes, I would say the effective side of it, or the level that you need to be at, is if you can make realistic, simple noises, the duck call is going to benefit your hunt as opposed to not benefit the hunt. And, being in the waterfowl sphere with a lot of guys going to trade shows doing that, the worst thing that someone does is they try to, run before they can walk. A basic quack, a simple chatter, and like maybe a 3 or 5 note sequence is really all that you technically need in order to, get results or help produce results. If you're trying to, do 20 note highballs and machine gun feeds and all this other stuff, that's just not that effective in the field to begin with. And not to mention, you don't have the skill level to pull it off. It's just, it's a lose-lose.
You're doing more harm than good at the point where you're trying to make all these sounds,
Correct.
but yet it's not effective or not natural. That makes a ton of sense. We see that. We see it on the competition stage, on elk as well. Like, we make a bunch of, sounds up there that it's like I would never make in the woods when I'm trying to call a bull in, or it's just it's
no,
for
exactly.
the stage
And I,
only.
like I said, that for the stage only is to prove that you're able to run a call in its high capacity, or just do things that other people just can't simply do. So it's it's the duck calling has kind of that same aspect.
Yeah. Well, I've got a bunch of other questions on duck calls, but we'll save those towards the end. But that's going to wrap it up for the Q&A section. Once again, if you have any questions of your own, please email us at ctd@Phelps Game Calls, and we'll make sure to get your question up and get it answered either by myself or our guests. Now we're going to jump into some of the duck hunting or duck call questions that I have. So I would consider myself here. I have got to go out in the field, 4 or 5 times and got to see from, people that know what they're doing, kind of what they've got. But I want to break this down on what are the absolutes? Like, what does a new waterfowl hunter need to go chase ducks versus what are, maybe what would be nice or preferred, and then kind of what are the luxuries, I guess. Me on the outside 3 years ago, never picking up a shotgun to go chase ducks. It's like, well, will my Mossberg 835 work, or do I need to have a new Benelli, Super Black Eagle, whatever that is now 2 or 3 or whatever, and there was a little bit of like, is there a difference? And so, like, walk us through that, what you need, what's nice to have, and then what's a real luxury.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you're going to do it on a super basic level, there's you have to have a shotgun. Gear wise, something warm, kind of like big game hunting. You want to dress for the appropriate stuff. As far as like, it doesn't matter what the gear is. Absolutely not. My first shotgun was an old Remington 870 from Walmart, and then I thought that I needed a big Benelli after that and everything else. It turns out that whether you shoot with the cheap pump or the Benelli, you got to hit the bird regardless to make things happen. I will admit that as you get into nicer things, there's some performance factor stuff that they tout or tell you that you need, and it can help. But most of it all relies on just your individual skill set, and so focusing on your ability to track birds, shoot, things like that is going to be way more important than the gun that's on your shoulder.
Okay, and then
other than that, gear wise, I mean, like, for myself, starting out, I was definitely a public rat race kind of hunter. I had, a dozen hot buys, a set of Cabela's waders, and my snowboarding jacket with my 870, and you can still get it done. I mean, like, it is a very gear heavy side of the sport, because we're the guys that run around in, the I call it designer fashion wear, Sitka gear, and, all the other stuff. And like, oh, if I have Optifade on, it means I kill more birds. And it's like, it definitely is not that way. It's very comfortable. It's nice to have, but it's not needed. You can still get it done with the same, army green wool pants that Grandpa had on.
Yep. And then one of the things as a new waterfowl hunter that really was overwhelming for me was like duck identification, because you look like, all right, you're in the Pacific Flyway. I can shoot 1 pintail. I can shoot 2. I don't remember what it was. You go through whether it's widgeon or Godwell, and they all have limits and this or that. what would be a good resource? Because I had somebody else calling the shots for me. Towards the end of the first day, I got to, be able to identify pintails and, widgeon and teal were, I would see them and then I wouldn't. And then I'd be like, oh, that was a teal. I started to figure things out, but like duck identification, sun in your eyes, what's a good resource and how does somebody gain confidence, in identifying ducks so that you don't have that fear or worry of going out there and, shooting the wrong limit.
Oh no, and I mean, we take a fair amount of people out, and you're doing the same thing. And I can't stress enough that even as a new waterfowl hunter, doing your research as far as what your local state provides you with regulations. Most of the time they do have pictures and things like that, but Google any type of internet source to try to find and be better at identifying birds is huge. The other side of it is time in the field. There's a patience factor that it takes to learn how to identify birds and do things, and if you don't know what it is, you shouldn't be shooting it regardless. So even if you are missing your limit opportunity to literally have a bird come in and say, I think that's a pintail, and then let it go by and go, yep, that was a pintail. That's a better approach to what you're doing instead of just shoot it and I thought it was a pintail and it turns out it was not. And so, for myself and even when we're taking other people there, we don't have the answers all the time, but if you can, kind of learn to get that patience factor in it, more than likely that bird is going to come by again and you'll get another crack at it. But until you can positively identify what that bird is, my recommendation to a new guy is to just be patient. You're going to be able to figure it out over and over and over again as you see them over and over and over again, but don't jump the gun and shoot something that you shouldn't.
Yep. And then as a new waterfowl hunter, one of the things this is fresh in my mind because all this stuff doesn't make sense to me yet is like, all right, you got to get a migratory bird on your license and then you got to buy a duck stamp. And I'm like, all right, you can't get a duck stamp if you want to go hunting, this weekend. And so like there are some states, like I think I was able to jump like on Wyoming since I already had like a big game license there. I was able to get like an E stamp, through the state of Wyoming because I don't believe I could get one from Washington that quickly. And
I mean, like it kind of depends on some of the hierarchies there. And so, like for instance, in Washington State, which is where I'm a resident of, I am required to purchase my small game license. I'm required to purchase my migratory bird. I believe they call it endorsement. I don't know if that term's correct there for Washington State. And then at the federal level, I have my duck stamp. So if I have one duck stamp that I bought for Washington State, that federal duck stamp is good for all of the states there, and then each individual states, whether I go to Missouri or any of the other places that we travel to quite often, I may have to buy a migratory validation for that individual state. But at the federal level, by having the duck stamp, I've met that requirement.
Gotcha. That makes more sense. And like I said, I always just, my duck hunts are usually somebody calls me on a Thursday night, like, do you want to go on Saturday? And I'm like, well, I can't, so then you're scrambling trying to buy an E stamp. But it works.
Yeah.
All the
and
same.
you can get the E stamps, get them there, print them out. What they're really after is, did you put into the, the federal fund, whether or not you have the stamp there, it goes back and forth. I think now, if I'm not mistaken, you don't even have to deface them anymore. They don't require you to sign them and have them. You can just put it on your license or do whatever. But yep, that federal stamp, man, I've been on a few different times where it's like, oh crap, can you go to the post office and go find me those because they're out at Sportsman's, and so we've been running around all over hell trying to find them.
Gotcha. So we touched on it a little bit in the Q&A. But in my limited experience, the blind locations or being on the X, and this is public land. A lot of people probably get to go out to their private pond, private lake, private edge, and they just know where they need to be. But my first entry to duck hunting was potholes there in Moses Lake, last year, and it's public water. Everything's wide open, and so we spent the first day scouting. And as I mentioned earlier, your blind location or being on the X maybe seems to, at least to me, seems to be more important than anything. Can you confirm that? And you had mentioned it earlier, but what goes into finding, what do the ducks want? How does the wind affect that location? What are you looking for? Because like some of the stuff, like a bird can't smell, what's the wind matter? But I realized really quickly, like wind, in a certain direction mattered. Kind of go through all of that. Yep. What's the ideal blind setup, cover, and then what factors go into picking that spot?
Sure. Well, I mean, you did hit the nail on the head. Location is, absolutely the number one deal. I can go to my parking lot and set up all my decoys and call all I want, but I'm still not going to get a bird there. And so, like, you have to make sure that you're in an area that does have birds in it. And so the scouting is absolutely huge. We spend more time scouting than we do hunting. We'll check a field 2, 3, 4 days in advance of a hunt. If we find something, we'll usually watch it build for a day. We spend more time looking through the binos than we do actually out in the field pulling the trigger. Now, a lot of our stuff is indeed, field hunting. You're patterning birds, you're doing things a little different. Whereas like potholes or, a public waterway, it's more about whether or not there's just birds in the general area. And then you have to try to find a way to, meet the criteria that you want. And so to answer the other side of the question, blind location, things like that, a lot of the times in a public hunting scenario, you're just kind of stuck with what you're given. And so even if the wind's not perfect, the sun's not perfect, you've got to try to find a way to make it work for you. For myself, I always try to make sure that the wind is coming, over my back, and that way the birds are forced more to land with the wind and coming into me for an easier shot. And that's really where the wind direction comes in. For big game, I know you want the wind kind of going the other way so the animal doesn't, smell you or like take off you. Like you said, I don't think the birds can smell me. I think there's research on whether they can smell or not, but for me, I'm more worried about if the wind's going this way, the bird is more likely to follow this flight path. And so I'll try to set up my blind to shoot a certain way based on the wind, and then also set my decoys and spread based upon that wind. And then, as the hunt progresses, you may have to adjust that. And to get them to line up perfectly where you got the sun at your back, the wind at your back, your decoys in the right spot, and birds in the area. Oh man, you got to count you buy a lotto ticket that day.
Yeah, and you alluded to one thing which was kind of surprising. We went over there and we spent the entire first day scouting. I'm like, I just assume duck hunters go sit on the water somewhere and you start quacking on a call and they're eventually going to show up to you. So we spent the morning glassing where the ducks wanted to be. Like, where are we seeing the most amount of ducks sitting on the water? Gathered all that information, and then we were hunting from a boat to get to these locations, went around on the boat, and then we drove the boat. We used Onyx. We knew what corner it was on. Potholes is kind of crazy because there's water everywhere and you don't know which turns which or what corner is which corner. So we all confirm, and then we drive the boat out there through that section of water, looking for where are we going to set up? Where, do we have natural cover? Do we need to bring in and make a blind? Like, where can we park the boat? All of this stuff starts to matter. And we got to a spot where we figured we had enough, natural cover. We had a pretty good, probably a 30 or 40 foot rise across from us. So the birds that were flying on the water didn't see our setup until they were there. So it was kind of just naturally they were going to fly by there anyways. And then we had pretty good open water behind us on the big water, so we could let our calls ring. And so, some of these things added up, and it was, I think we had limited out by midday. And so it was a good hunt, but I started to notice, like, it was more about that spot because potholes, public land, lots of people hunting it, near the holidays. And in my opinion, and maybe good callers or too many good callers, but you would just see birds flying over, and the call didn't really seem to do anything. It was just, because you could hear the guys, the next blind over, they would see the birds slightly after we did, and then they would start their calling sequence, and then the guys past them would see. And it was one of those things where it's like, all right, in my opinion, and maybe it's a skewed opinion based on the situation we were given, but man, you just want to be where those ducks want to be, and blow on the call, get them to recognize your spread, and then that's really what matters, not necessarily how good you can call, how loud you can call, any of that stuff. Those birds were going to where they wanted to be anyways.
Yeah, correct. I mean, and, it does depend on the situation and where you're at. I mean, obviously, 90% of the battle is just being where the birds want to be. After that, now we're starting to get into the subtleties. Are they responding to the call? Are they not? Do you even need to call? Are they just dropping right in? Like, it sort of depends where you're at. We also, hunt situations where we call it running traffic, where you're, putting yourself in a flyway where they're flying over the top of you. They're going somewhere else, and you're just making as much noise and trying to be as crazy as possible to get them to be like, oh, wait, no, the party's over here, it's not over there, and then they line up and run you. So depending upon the situation that you're in, sometimes the calling works, sometimes it doesn't. And in a place like potholes, man, those birds hear every person from every side of the state blowing at them from every corner. They, I think my philosophy on potholes for a while was like, if I just leave my calls in the boat, I'm probably going to be more successful because they've heard everybody else already call at them.
Yeah, and on that one, not knowing, like, whether we sit here all day or whether we move, we kept seeing all these birds hit water, probably a half mile kind of back to us to the right, and then no gunshots. And we're like, we know that there's a million hunters on the water. There just must not be hunters on that. And so we use that information. We went and took a half mile, three quarters of a mile hike through the brush and went and found where all these birds were landing, and then, adjusted our setup for the next day. Just to be where those birds wanted to be. Obviously they're getting bumped out of all the spots with all the blinds and everybody else hunting. It was just, I think, all hunting in general, whether it's big game, whether it's predator, like just being a smart hunter and realizing, like, let's not force the issue on the spot or the exit we're hunting. Like, they obviously want to be over there. Let's move our setup the next day, that evening, whatever it may be, and go to the ducks and not make the ducks come to us.
Oh, well, and I mean, public duck hunting, that's always the mantra. No matter what you do, you have to be able to pivot and be flexible and, move. When something's not working, something's not going your way, you want to try to salvage the hunt as much as possible. So, yeah, I mean, make a switch, pull the decoys, move something, go find a different spot, and, also have the same wherewithal. You're going to get up one day and go give it a shot and everything looks great, but it's just not your day.
Yep. So we were just hunting all day until we hit limits. If you had to pick, do you prefer morning and evening, or are you on that same all day hunt until you limit, or do you just say, I'm going to hunt from 8 to 12? Like, is there a better time, in your mind to be out there on the water or field?
Well, in some places like Washington, we're somewhat spoiled where they don't have a lot of regulations as far as whether you can hunt the evening, only hunt the morning, only hunt until a certain time. There are other states where you can only be in refuges from X amount of time to, 10:30 to 11 to something like that. And there's some states that even regulate that. So, for us around here, if you're going to take the day and go enjoy it, we typically find a way to spend most of the day. But it does depend on, weather conditions, what we're seeing, how things are looking. Because, if I had a choice, I actually enjoy hunting the afternoons more than anything else. Almost the rat race of, like, everybody's racing each other to the boat ramp. The craziness is, gone. And so you're able to kind of sneak in on the end and, have maybe not as successful of a shoot, but it's a little more relaxed. You don't have to get up at, 1 a.m. to get down to potholes in time by 3 to be on the water. You set your decoys legally by 4 and then hold down your spot, all day. And it's like, man, I had an extra 12 hours to this just to go duck hunting. I'd rather just wait till the afternoon, get there, roll in, and be happy. So I'm definitely I call it like a fair weather side of duck hunting on that one. But my most successful hunts that I can remember, they involved especially on public, that grind, sleeping in the truck at midnight, getting on it and just going crazy. I'm getting old enough now where I appreciate sleep more than I do duck meat. So
yeah. So that was a good segue in. You'd mentioned called yourself a fair weather duck hunter. We talked about time of day. Do you have a preference? We saw, at least on potholes, like a little bit of wind was good. Still seemed to be, they didn't like to fly as much when it got still there in the potholes. Do you have a preference? Do you want it rainy, nasty, raining sideways? Do you want it, clear and, high pressure? Like what's the kind of it
for me, man? The most successful times that I've had, out hunting are the ones that I remember as the best. Weren't the ones where I was, soaking frickin' wet by 8 a.m. and it was just miserable. And yeah, sure, it's, everybody's got this like Norman Rockwell idea of, quintessential duck hunting where it's just pissing cats and dogs and the ladies looking over at the guy like, what the hell are we doing out here? For me, clear and cold has always been, a better way for me to hunt. I like hunting on, some people don't like bluebird days, so to speak, but like when the sun's out, bird identification is a hell of a lot easier. For myself, in my own opinion, I think the sun helps create some shadows that can also help hide me better, especially if I have the sun in the correct location. It can also like show my face and everything a lot better if it's not in the right spot. So it is, a bit of a catch-22. But for myself personally, my favorite way to hunt is absolutely, pristine, clear, and cold. And I do like at least maybe like a 5 to 7 mile an hour sustained wind, just so there's a little bit of ripple on the water and it gives, the spread some direction. It just kind of helps set a little bit of an edge on the hunt.
Yeah. And my location, I'm 30 minutes away from the Pacific Ocean harbors, Grays Harbor, Willapa Harbor. And I think this is one of the biggest, one of the reasons I absolutely never wanted to go hunting. I got asked all the way from high school on, you want to go, combine goose duck hunt? And I'm like, no. Yep. And the reason why is they wouldn't go unless the wind was blowing 40 miles an hour and the rain was hitting the side of the face. That made the good waterfowl, hunting weather around here. And I'm like, that sounds like zero fun to go up, go set up your decoys, go set everything up in the dark, sit there and get soaked and freeze to death. So I'd always looked at that, but we went over to the east side and, similar to your mentioning, bluebird days with a little bit of wind, and it was pretty enjoyable. You stayed warm, and I could get used to that a whole lot quicker than I could, getting poured on out on the coast.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I've been on hunts that are that same way where it's just miserable and there's nothing flying and you're like, oh, if we only had some weather, and like you can point your finger at one way or another, what worked, what didn't. And I mean, there's been a couple of them that I've been on, like in Kansas or some of the others where it's exactly the situation you're talking about. I was in California one time, and it's not a joke. It was when the Oroville Dam was gonna flood, and we were down there in the floodplain. And it was raining. I think it rained 2.5 inches in 4 hours. Like, it was just absolutely nuts. But same thing, 55-mile-an-hour winds, and I think we shot 145 snows and specks in our group. But it was the most miserable day I've ever been out hunting. But man, we got some shooting in. It was it was cool. So I just didn't like literally wringing out my underwear before I got in the truck. Like, this is dumb. I might as well have gone swimming.
Yeah. The duck hunting was great. The enjoyment factor was pretty low. It sounds like on one of those.
Yep, exactly.
We've all seen plenty of gadgets and fads come and go, but here's one product that stood the test of time: Seafoam Motor Treatment. Lots of hunters and anglers know that Seafoam helps engines run better and last longer. It's really simple. When you pour it in your gas tank, Seafoam cleans harmful fuel deposits that cause engine problems. I'm talking common stuff like hard starts, rough engine performance, or lost fuel economy. Seafoam is an easy way to prevent or overcome these problems. Just pour a can in your gas tank and let it clean your fuel system. You probably know someone who has used a can of Seafoam to get their truck or boat going again. People everywhere rely on Seafoam to keep their trucks, boats, and small engines running the way that they should the entire season. Help your engine run better and last longer. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.
There's nothing like snook hook sets at dawn or catching a tarpon in the moonlight. Find your next fishing trip made easy on fishingbooker.com and experience the magic of the Sunshine State or any other destination on your fishing bucket list. Book a blue water adventure in search of sailfish or go snapper fishing with the kids. With over 6,000 captains and trips to choose from, planning your next one just got a whole lot easier. Download the Fishing Booker app on the Google Play or App Store, or visit them online at fishingbooker.com to book your trip today.
Now we're going to kind of jump into the calls. I'm going to have you on the spot give us kind of a 5-minute quick and dirty version on the history of duck calls, from where they started kind of to where we're at today. And some people might be surprised at the history of duck calls.
Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, most of the duck calling, if you were to look it up as far as when the first patent was filed, I believe it was in the late 1800s. But duck calling as we know it now, really duck calls and duck calling, so to speak, really didn't take off until realistically right after the Second World War. I mean, 45, you had Chick Majors and a couple of the other guys out there. P.S. Olt, he's been around for a long time out of Peking, Illinois. I think they were a 100-year-old duck call company. I mean, it's been a rich history as far as the last 100 to 125 years or so. Really is where duck calls and how they progressed have pretty much been at. Fortunately, and where we're at now, sure, we've gotten some advances as far as things like materials, and stuff like that. But the technology itself, as far as whether it's a J-frame or a reel foot or a Louisiana style board, all of those terms and designs are still very much so in play today. And so, as far as what's the newest, latest, and greatest thing in duck calls, you're looking at guys that are just tweaking and perfecting and, changing the performance factor of designs and, and aspects that have been around now for, 100 plus years.
Gotcha. And we'll touch into what goes into designing a call. And one thing I want to kind of preface this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong from a duck call standpoint, but what we've realized is whether it's an external elk call, whether it's a deer call, whether it's a duck call, when you're using what typically is a piece of mylar that's cut to a shape with a certain weight, in order to get any of these sounds, it's basically vibration of a piece of mylar, whether it's 10 mil, whether it's 14 mil, whether it's a short board, whatever it may be. A goose call uses a 14 mil short reed. All we're doing is asking this piece of mylar to vibrate over a certain radius, a specified radius, whether, a predator board's going to have a tighter, I'm going to throw a number out there, a 2.5 inch radius, and a deer call may have whatever it may be, it's longer. We're playing with the weights on the reeds, but when we go to design these type of calls, we're looking at radius, we're looking at mylar shape, thickness, we're looking at what the tone channel width and depth, because that gives us a volume of air that can pass under that mylar reed. You're looking at your bores. So kind of walk us through that. That's kind of a generality of all calls that use a piece of vibrating mylar. And it's crazy to think, you take our easy estrus or even all the way down to our little youngin calf call. We're taking a skinnier, thinner piece and changing its length. So you get a very high frequency buzz, all the way up to 2,500 hertz. So you're able to get those elk tones. And then you're able to really take a duck or even more, I would say, like a buck grunt. You're able to vibrate that reed very, very slow. And you're really hearing the oscillation of that reed is what's giving, it's not a high pitch. So you're able to do the extremes from a buck grunt all the way to an elk, calf mew. While we're on duck calls though, kind of go through and explain to us, how, there's a little more to duck calls. We do look at it on the elk call side, but there's volume in your barrel, whether you're going to taper the barrel, whether, cause that's going to affect how much the call loads up. You're going to backbore the barrel, affects your volume. So I've kind of spoiled a little bit of it.
Yeah, I was say, man, you answered a lot right off the shoot. Good for you, but you've been paying attention. No, there's the simplest way to put it is pretty much in a duck call sphere or even a goose call sphere, everything affects everything. Whether or not you have the answers to exactly how much you need to do to get what you're looking for, that's a different subject, and end user and how people blow things. I mean, that's really where it's at. But to try to put something to spin it so a bass guy would understand it, I typically attune anything to do with a duck call very similar to a guitar. The looser that you make it, sure, the sloppier the vibration, the more buzz, the more everything that you get out of it. And it's the same thing, with the duck call and the radiuses that you were talking about. If you put too much slope on it, it doesn't sound like a duck. The reed doesn't vibrate fast enough, and you've, built up a buck grunt or something else. And so you're trying to find, a way to, as you mentioned, take different weights of mylar, different lengths, different cuts, different widths, and apply those within, dimensions that make sense for the part that you're making. But yeah, man, I mean, it's infinite possibilities as far as whether or not you're using, a 1/4 inch tone channel, a 6 millimeter tone channel, whether you're, going all the way up to 17/64, and you can do so much different stuff within that sphere that you might accidentally end up pushing a J-frame design into something of a cut down design, or, it just sort of moves as, as we do in the marketplace, and you're going to start, pushing boundaries one way or the other. And that's how we, come up with different ideas to make calls operate.
Yeah. And, so I'm just going to kind of throw some terminology out there. I know what they mean a little bit, not to the extent you do, but, when I was getting into, 5 years ago and it's oh, you got to have a duck call in your lineup. And it's okay. I understand, as I mentioned earlier, I understand how mylar vibrates. I can look at duck call inserts, aside from, putting one of the popular echo inserts in. My first call was to you. I'm like, Alex, I got help me understand this. Help me understand the process. And so we started to walk through, and so it was oh, well, open water versus timber, double versus single. I think some of these and correct me if I'm wrong, some of these names have been put on a call just because of maybe the way it leans a little bit, like, oh, it's a louder call, like it's more of an open water call versus like, oh, it's a quieter call. It's going to, it gets labeled a timber or, kind of explain, singles versus doubles, open versus timber. And then we'll kind of jump into some other questions based off of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, like very much so in the duck call sphere, it's like anything else, right? Like if you just go to Lowe's and say screwdriver, like there's endless possibilities, and duck calls definitely fall into, that same way. And so you've got, a little bit of situational kind of stuff that you want to do with duck calling, try to match that with what that company's, marketing as far as like, oh yes, it's an open water call. Well, if you were to compare my open water call to say Echo's or somebody else's, you could probably find some dissimilarities and some also, similarities between the two. But the common nomenclature on something like if you were to say an open water call typically means that it's got a much more open back bore in it, so you can push more air through it and create more volume, whereas something in a timber style is usually choked down a little bit so it's not as loud. And that's really where it comes into the situations that you're hunting and what tool do you need to do the job, where you're at. Because if you're on the Columbia River and you're trying to use, like, for instance, the Hive in my lineup is my softest running double reed. Well, if you're in a wide open, area and you're trying to produce volume, that's not the call that you want to use as far as, doing what you want. So, making sure that you have the right call for the right job, is pretty important. And, I can tell you as a manufacturer in doing this, a lot of calls do gravitate towards the middle because we want to try to find something that is A, user friendly, and B, very, versatile. I know we talked about it, but like these things aren't necessarily just cheap. You're not going to go out and spend, only $5 and get what you want. Most waterfowl calls are upwards of $120 to $140 at a whack. And so you want to try to find a way to get the most bang for your buck, which typically means you're finding something that operates right down the center. So you avoid things like wide open water calls or like way too timbery calls, unless if you need that tool for that job.
Gotcha. So as a new caller going in, what would be your recommendation? Like, I know everybody's going to, I tell people the same thing on the elk call side. Like, well, just because you're a new caller doesn't mean you don't blow like, you've been doing this for 30 years. You might blow with a ton of air and a ton of effort versus, so new caller is not always the right thing, but what would you recommend a new caller? Like if they're looking at a call, are they looking at a double reed, open water? Or what would you recommend as far as like new caller getting into duck calling so they can gain confidence and make duck sounds to get going?
In most cases, picking up something that is, advertised from that manufacturer as their all around, duck call is typically a better solution for a beginning duck hunter. I can only speak to, kind of what's in my lineup and, how we do things around here. Whereas like, materials, price, things like that shouldn't necessarily be a big factor, in your decision. I mean, everybody's got, a budget as far as that goes. And I produce, polycarb calls that are $20 all the way up to, fancy wood and acrylic ones that are, upwards of, 200 or more. And so, whatever you're comfortable within your budget getting is really, the answer of, what call should you get. But in most cases, you're going to find, that a good running single or double reed, whichever one, personal preference. And we'll get into that a little bit on why you choose one or the other. But, which one's going to fit you, what materials that you like, because those materials are going to, cost you less, more, whichever way you want to go about it.
Yeah. And new caller versus experience, you had 5 years ago, we had came out with a single and a double reed, through you guys training me and me practicing and figuring out, like the single reeds typically wider and, less of a dog ear versus your double reeds are typically a little skinnier and they've got more of a taper on the end. We're dealing with just trying to get weight off the end to get them to tune in to a duck. Is it just my own opinion that like experienced callers, and they don't have to lean into them, but like your single reads are typically geared towards your more experienced callers or people that have more time with it. There's a little more effort, a little more air required. Is that always hold true that your double reads will be a little bit more user friendly and your single reads may be more experienced, or is that just how the ultimate design kind of comes out?
A lot of it does come down to ultimate design, but there is something to be said, and when you're talking about, whether it's easy to use or not, I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. It's not like if I don't know how to present air, if I don't know how to control my diaphragm, if I have crappy hands, that I'm going to pick up a double reed and all of a sudden I'm just going to sound like a duck because it's a double reed. You still very much so have to focus on your fundamentals, making sure you're making proper notes, proper mouth mechanics, hand mechanics, all of that still is in effect, whether it's a single reed or double reed. The forgiveness factor in how, a new caller may not be able to pressurize and stabilize their air the same way that an experienced caller would. So out of a single reed, that one reed is going to flex, bend, and make those different notes, whereas a double reed, it kind of hides it a little bit. And so the forgiveness factor in a double reed is typically what draws a new hunter to the double reed side instead of the single reed side.
Gotcha. Yeah, you guys are helping us work on a new single reed that I've been practicing on. I've got it sitting here on my desk, and it's what I would call.
You're sounding good, bud. You're sounding good.
It would be like a wide open call, in my opinion. This is my own terminology. Like,
correct.
I can hammer on that thing. It sounds like a duck. It stays there. And I went and grabbed one of the double reeds one of the original double reeds, and I went to blow on it kind of with the same idea, the same pressure and everything, and it just fell on its face. I'm like, all right, you had to retrain yourself. Like, this double reed takes about half the air to sound, it was just one of those things where it's like, wow, you're so used to that one that it takes you a couple, quacks to kind of figure out where you need to be and how much air and get it to sound like a duck again. So on tuning,
that's just, hey man, that's practice.
Yep. You had mentioned a little bit practice. On tuning. We were talking, dog ears, we were talking shortening reeds. I had a customer call the other day, like, hey, we bought 2 of your calls. One of them sounds awesome. One of them's missing a little bit. And I just asked him to take pictures of the reeds, and you can tell that one reed was quite a bit shorter. So we had him pull the cork out, readjust it, give himself a little bit longer reed so that he could push on the call a little bit more. And we got it turned right around. But can you walk us through kind of duck tuning 101, just the quick and dirty, what matters, what doesn't? I know it probably, it's a little bit different on each tone board, each bore, but kind of the overall what matters and what changes from reed to reed.
The basic concept behind tuning a duck call is that you're trying to get it to fit with how your style of calling is. And so the simple, I guess, way of looking at it is typically the longer the reed, the more air it's going to take and the deeper the tone it's going to have. So as you put in a fresh reed, you're going to start clipping it back, and you need to find that happy medium between the response and the feel that you want and the tone that you want. And so it is a very tedious process, and it's something that most people get frustrated with because they expect to just throw a reed in and it sounds like a duck right away. And it's like, no, there's very much so a finite tuning level. And even in my own lineup, and when we're dealing with customers and trying to make sure that calls fit them and things along those lines, it is very much so a fit discussion, because how much air I can produce versus how much air you can produce versus Trevor or Joe Schmo customer, it's all different. And so you have to find a way to make that thing fit you. And typically, like I said, the longer the reed, the deeper the tone, but the more air it's going to take. And so if you feel that you're blowing through the call or like it doesn't have enough backbone, you technically need a longer reed, because from a feel standpoint, the reed is too short. Now, from a tone standpoint, if you're trying to change something, that's where some of the dog ear stuff comes in. And the thinner you make that reed on the end, the more it'll respond in low pressure, but it still has enough backbone with it to hit it higher. So it is very much so a guess and check kind of mentality. And the best part about a duck call is Mylar's cheap. So by all means, get a reed pack from you, from me, from anybody, and just start going nuts, because there is no perfect answer. But I think I was telling you the same thing when you're tuning a duck call, less is more. And so with how much you clip and change, you're really after like the width of a sheet of paper as far as adjustments go. And like clip, put it back together, give it a test, run it a little bit. I don't like how that feels. Pull it apart, clip, do it again, and just over and over and over until you get it to exactly where you like it.
Yeah, and in my limited experience, one of the things I notice more with duck calls versus any of my other calls, whether it's elk or predator, is the balance of how much air the call could take or needs or can't take versus still sound like a duck. And there seems to be like this crossover point where, all right, now the call, I can put as much air to it as I want, but I no longer sound like a duck. So it's like, all right, maybe that's a width thing, or maybe that's a length thing, or maybe that's take dog ears out because you need the right weight. And so I found that, duck calls more than any other call is like that balance of air pressure versus, maintaining your correct tone that you want out of the call.
Yep. Well, and I mean, there's a variance factor in duck calls, as well. That's not necessarily there with, elk, deer, or some of the other ones. Ducks have a very wide spectrum as far as the sounds, tones, volumes, things that they're able to produce even in a natural environment. And I know there's some variance in elk as well, but in the call itself, you have a lot more freedom on a duck call to change the reeds and do things than you do on, let's say, an elk call. Because, the width of an elk reed affects function way more than it does in a duck call. And so, you got more room to play, in a duck call than you do with, elk or anything else. So by all means, if you got a call that's not performing right or doing anything, swap out the reeds and try some different tuning and see if you can make it fit how you think it should.
Okay. Yeah, that's great advice. I'm going to dive into materials a little bit. We mentioned earlier the history of them. I think one of the things that we've found as time went on, we're using better materials, whether that's, 100% acrylic, whether we're using, high-end composites like, the micartas, some of the engineered materials. What do you feel that a duck can tell a difference between like a polycarbonate or an acrylic call? Or is it the fact that call can be handed down for 3 generations and still probably be fine, where, the polycarbonate could be squished give me your rundown on materials and if they matter.
For myself, my all-time favorite kind of call to use is actually a wood call. I do believe that, like, from a natural tone and sound standpoint, like, woods are some of the better calls, but they do have a maintenance factor, and it's very difficult for a lot of people to maintain a wood call for years and years and years. So from a manufacturing standpoint, an industry standard is acrylic, and there's a vanity side of that goes with it as well, because you can get acrylic in every color of the rainbow. It can be laser engraved. Like, you can make these things look really cool, out of the acrylic factor. The acrylic is actually, incredibly dense as well, and so it does a good job of not altering the sound that comes out of it. If you're using an acrylic call, you're typically very crisp, very clean, and whatever you're putting into the call is transferred out in the sound that's there. Whereas like wood, Delrin, some of these softer compounds, they absorb, a little bit of that sound and vibration, and so it alters your tone. Polycarbonate, things like that, it's regarded as a cheap product. It actually does make a very, solid product as far as function and things, but it's cheap plastic. It's mass produced and injection molded, and I talking down on it, but I have my own molds and everything else myself. But it's just that it either fits or you don't. And for myself, if I don't have a wood call, I'm typically leaning to acrylic, and if acrylic's not an option, then Delrin is my next, and then polycarb is typically on the end of the spectrum for myself personally. But I mean, I know a lot of guys that still kill a lot of ducks with a DR85, man, and like they works just fine.
Yep. Gotcha. And one thing I like about materials, acrylic or, some of the engineered materials, is I don't get a call from Alex on like a Tuesday. Like, we have a problem. That batch of Osage that we got is no good, so that's what I love about them. It's pretty consistent, as it's cast rod, and so that's one thing I do like about material, an engineered material. But like you said, I love, a lot of our turkey calls, we can't get around wood. But yeah, it is nice to have something consistent, especially, when you see all the processes that these calls got to go through. The barrel goes through the lathe, then it goes through polish, and then the insert of the keg goes through the mill. It's like, if something pops on the last stage, like, it's just frustrating. It's like you went through the entire process of building a call, and then we lost it at, and the milling and stuff has a higher likelihood of doing that. And so I don't know, from a manufacturer standpoint, like, sometimes I feel like it's hitting the easy button. Like, yeah, it's going to be a little more expensive, but it's going to be consistent, and I know we're not going to have issues with it. So let's go ahead and pick acrylic.
And Ben, I'd have to agree with you on that one. I mean, it's a man-made material. You don't have these oddities that come out of it, and like you mentioned, you're gonna get wood where sometimes it is just trash. There's a knot in it. There's something that was not there, but there's also that little bit of nostalgia and nuance factor in, like, every single wood call that comes off. They're all different. Yes, they're all the same, but like, every one of them's different. Where like black acrylic, it's the same from start to finish, man. There's nothing, you're not going to find this like, ooh, this is a really cool piece in the middle of it. So, there's some of that in the surprise factor that like you just don't get from anything else. But you are 100% correct on the manufacturing side of life, and the consistent results in every single call over and over and over, and repeatability factor. I mean, acrylic is pretty much pretty much where it's at, and that's why it is indeed the industry standard, especially in in waterfowl calls.
Gotcha. Okay, I could have Googled this, but I'm going to put myself out there and ask, what is the difference between a cut down versus a meat call? And explain that to me, because you hear it said all the time, but I want to hear your explanation.
Well, I mean, if for me, I don't know if the two things that you're talking about there are actually on the same deal. A cut down is a style of call that originated from an old PS old, and then meat calls, so to speak. I guess I think that's actually like a term as far as like a contest goes. Like you have like a Main Street calling contest, you have a meat calling contest, or a live calling contest, and so the two aren't necessarily one and the same, or can be compared.
Gotcha.
Like
Comparable.
I think one's a style of a call, and one's are different calling contests as far as that goes.
Gotcha.
Or at least that's how I'm reading that question. So
yeah. It was more of I've heard these calls referred to, cut down calls or meat calls.
Yep.
So maybe it was phrased the wrong way, but just what the definition, because it's like, unless I go Google it, like I don't know what that means.
Well, and I mean, a cut down is indeed just if you had to put a very simple way of thinking about it, it's like an ultra aggressive style of a J-frame. It's got a wide open bore, typically a 14 mil reed, and it's designed to, really produce harsh, barky sounds down in the Arkansas timber. Whereas, something that's more like my J-frame style calls, they're a little bit softer, neater. They run, at kind of a higher frequency level, like you were talking about with some of the elk stuff. So the cut down is kind of a style of a call. It's not necessarily a type of calling, I guess is the way to put it.
Well, thanks for running us through those calls. In closing, if you had one tip to help, duck hunters out there be successful this year, what would it be?
Oh man, just try to stay positive, because it is definitely one of those things where you can get spoiled really quick by showing up on a hunt and shoot your 7 and be like, this is the greatest thing in the world. But you're gonna have days where you're gonna sit out there and wonder why the hell you did this. But it's a long game. The season's really long for waterfowl compared to a lot of big game stuff, and so there's tons of opportunity, and get out, try to enjoy it. It's a lot of fun, and it should stay that way. So like I said, try to stay positive and have fun doing it.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I really appreciate having you on today, Alex. Thanks for all your time. Thanks for everything, and good luck out there this year.
Absolutely, man. Well, hopefully, hey, we got a couple months. You're done hunting the big game stuff, right? The stuff with furs. Come on, man. Let's go chase some feathers.
Let's go chase some. All right, we might have to do that. All right, thanks.
Sounds like a plan, bud.
Outdoor adventure won't wait for engine problems. Things like hard starts, rough performance, and lost fuel economy are often caused by fuel gum and varnish buildup. Seafoam can help your engine run better and last longer. Simply pour a can in your gas tank. Hunters and anglers rely on Seafoam to keep their engines running the way it should the entire season. Pick up a can of Seafoam today at your local auto parts store or visit seafoamworks.com to learn more.